Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ninth episode in the ongoing series here on Svarm Chatter, Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. The past 2 weeks, the past two episodes covered the riots in Spain in 1391 in the Kingdom of Castile and Aragon. And if you haven't heard them, I would recommend you listen to those. This episode is a overview of the Spanish Inquisition. I think when I announced here or when I've told people that I'm doing a series on Spain, everybody's question always is the Inquisition. It seems like when you talk about Spain and Jews, the number one thing, I don't know, it's a tie between the Inquisition and the expulsion of 1492. And tied together with all that is Moranos, Conversos, New Christians, whichever term you want to use. So it didn't make sense to start the series with 1492 or the Inquisition, but here we are with the Inquisition. And there's already been a episode on the series, a terrific episode about the Papal Inquisition, which predates the Spanish Inquisition. But this episode with Professor Homza is about the Spanish Inquisition. There are a lot of works on the Spanish Inquisition. I think we reference them here. Professor Homza's is an anthology about the Inquisition, various primary sources. It's a really terrific book. There's obviously also Henry Kamen's book on the Inquisition. There's been Benzion Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu's father, his book on the Inquisition, and many more. So there'll be some of those links in the show's notes, and you can check that out. But again, following 1391, as you've heard, when the forced conversions of many Jews and kind of the rise of the new Christian, Morano, Converso, you kind of, that's really when the Inquisition comes to be. And we're, of course, jumping ahead to the late 15th century here with the Inquisition here, but 1478, around there. But this will be, I think it really belongs after that, and maybe we'll walk back and forth. And there's going to be a variety of number of episodes, really covering the Spanish Inquisition, some more specific, some more general. And this episode is really general/specific. It's going to be a general overview of the entire Inquisition, but there will be specific stories. And I think that really the story, once you get to post 1391, it's not so much in chronological order as it is. Will be discussed. The episodes all end up. The stories really, the Inquisition ends up covering from then on through 1492. So it'll kind of be all over the place, but it's not, if that makes sense. So enjoy, or again in air quotations, air quotes, because it's not enjoy. It's a very sad thing. Of course, it affected a lot of Morano, new Christians. But as you'll hear, the Inquisition did not try Jews. They didn't have jurisdiction over Jews. They only had jurisdiction to try heretics to the Catholic Church. So, which involved Jews that had converted and that were lapsing back into Judaism. So they were Judaizing. So that's something that hopefully clarifies a misconception about the Spanish Inquisition, and what they were trying to do. And I'll let you hear. Hear Professor Homza has to say, and I'd be very curious to hear if you have feedback about the podcast, about the episode, about the Inquisition, and there will be more about the Inquisition, and you'll get to hear from a variety of different scholars about their opinions on the Inquisition, because especially how they use Inquisition documents for historical purposes, there's difference of opinion regarding that. So email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com, if you have any feedback on this, and also another reason to put it here, I think it's kind of appropriate in some ways. It's Tisha B'Av coming up tonight, tomorrow, and Tisha B'Av is when this podcast is being released first. And this is Spanish Inquisition is, again, they didn't try Jews, they tried Morano, new Christians, forced converts to Judaism, so they were Jews in our minds. And this is something that really affected the Jewish people, and in a very bad way, and it's a very sad story, of course. And this is something that went on until the 19th century. The Spanish Inquisition. Again, it didn't only try Jews. It, of course, tried witches, purported witches, and other blasphemies and other things against the Catholic Church, heretics of the Catholic Church. But you'll hear more about the Inquisition. I would like to thank the sponsor of the series, the Spanish Jewry series, which is Gluck Plumbing, for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division, from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, camera-ing main lines, to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523 1836 extension 1, 732-523-1836 extension 1. If you'd like to sponsor an episode or to just support the episode and support the podcast in any way, you can check out in the show's notes. That is via PayPal or Chase QuickPay/Zelle. That's farmchatter@gmail.com. The information is there. I very much appreciate it. And just in general feedback, I've actually gotten some very nice emails and WhatsApp messages in the past a couple of weeks about the Spanish Jewry series, and it sounds like listeners have been enjoying. If you haven't, let me know. But if you have, especially, let me know. I appreciate hearing the feedback, and I just want feedback one way or the other. I want to hear. I know there's a lot of people listening. That much I know. I see the statistics, but I'm curious to hear what listeners think, and I'll try to get back to you. So you can send me an email, farmchatter@gmail.com. And with that, again, enjoy is kind of a funny word here, but I hope you find this discussion on the Spanish Inquisition enlightening, and yeah. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast and another series on Spanish Jewry. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Lou Ann Homza, who is James Pinckney Harrison Professor of History at William and Mary, and we'll be discussing the Spanish Inquisition. Specifically, Professor Homza has a book she edited and translated titled The Spanish Inquisition, 1478 to 1614, an anthology of sources, as well as a number of other books. But this book specifically deals with the Inquisition. And I believe, Professor Homza, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that this is the only English translation of primary sources in the Spanish Inquisition. So thank you, Professor Homza, for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's delightful to be on. I can't wait to speak with you, and I hope that your listeners will contact me if they have any further questions. That would be great.
Great. Terrific. Okay, so let's tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so I am a first-generation graduate student at the University of Chicago. I was born in Oklahoma. My parents moved a great deal. I went to Bolivia as an exchange student when I was 17, because I hated high school so much that I graduated a year early and fled on the Rotary program to Santa Cruz, Bolivia, where I lived for a year. And I had 5 years of French and no Spanish. And that's how I learned Spanish. And from there, it kind of ricocheted into studying Spanish history at the University of Chicago. And I've been at William & Mary since 1992. I specialize in what we call early modern Europe, which is sort of an oxymoron. How can things be both early and modern? But that's what makes it really interesting to study. And I specialize in Italy and Spain between about 1400 and 1700. So how specifically did you get interested in Spanish and Inquisition history, and especially that you published this and you translated this anthology here of sources? Well, I did, and that was really accidental. My first book, which is called Religious Authority in the Spanish Renaissance, which was published in 2000, the first chapter involves a very deep, close reading of a gigantic Inquisition trial of one of the most famous intellectuals in the first half of the 16th century in Spain. And I had never read Inquisition sources before, and I became absolutely hooked after reading that particular source. And I thought, man, I want to work more on this. I want to do, more investigations on this. And so that led kind of naturally to doing the primary source reader. Okay, we'll talk more about that, and I'm sure you'll discuss some of those really interesting sources throughout. So let's start off with Inquisition. We're talking about the Inquisition. What does the Inquisition mean? Where does that term come from? Okay, so this is always amazing to students of mine. The term inquisitio is a Latin term that literally means inquiry. And so Inquisition actually dates to the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic. And what it means in essence is that human beings investigate public crimes, and they inquire into them, and they amass evidence testimony. They interrogate suspects. They administer punishments. And so what happens in a nutshell is that Roman law, through the Justinian Codex and Digest in the 6th century, actually are resurrected in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. And all these concepts of inquisitio or inquiry, legal inquiry, human beings doing the investigating, everything that you might see on popular television right now with, any of your popular crime shows, that is indebted to inquisitio. So in the 12th and 13th centuries, European rulers, kings, counts, popes, realized how advantageous it would be to have a codified legal system instead of coping, like the poor kings of France, with about 18 different legal codes, depending upon the region, and all these different privileges that they have to deal with. So instead, why not make it uniform? Why not standardize things? And so that's how Inquisition gets going. So we can see from the last couple of decades of the 12th century and then the beginning of the 13th century, how kings and popes begin to issue statements that endorse Roman law or that replicate Roman law. So, for instance, in 1197, the King of Aragon, Pedro, whatever his number is, says, we are going to hunt down heretics and we're going to confiscate their property. And then Innocent the eighth says the ninth says in 1199, heretics are comparable to traitors against God, which is exactly the kind of language that ancient Rome used with traitors against Roman emperors. So what happens actually is that your Christian rulers, your kings and your popes, decide to expand the notion of treason to treason against God, which makes sense given their Christian orientation and the fact that heresy, which is supposed to be a sustained, persistent, public rejection of orthodoxy, the fact that that has been a concern from the beginning of Christianity. If you were to read the Apostle Paul's epistles in the Christian New Testament, he's desperately worried about Christians who are undermining the faith. And so that's been a concern throughout Christianity. But with the help of Roman law, popes and kings in the 12th and 13th centuries begin to figure out how to combat it in a legal way that they didn't have before. So, okay, Gregory the Ninth, Pope Gregory IX, 1231, decides to appoint a Dominican friar as an inquisitor of heretical depravity. What a scary title. And he gives the inquisitors the power to go out and search for religious malefactors within a certain geographical region and for a specific period of time. And that kicks off what we call the medieval inquisitions. And we always use that term as a plural because medieval popes allowed inquisitors to work for specific periods of time, for specific geographical regions, and then they were done. So it was a very limited mandate. Moving forward to the Spanish Inquisition, 1478, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain were desperately worried about their Jewish population that had converted to Christianity through force in 1391. They were told that their converts to Christianity were still practicing Jewish law. They appealed to Pope Sixtus IV for the ability to start an inquisition. The Pope responded, and in the moment of complete ineptitude, the Pope said, fine, you get to appoint the inquisitors, which had never happened before. And at that moment, Ferdinand and Isabel said, yippee, we're already accustomed to appointing high ecclesiastical officials in the Catholic Church. Now we get to appoint inquisitors. And poor Pope Sixtus IV thought, wow, I really blew it. I need to try and get back this privilege. And he couldn't do it. Ferdinand of Aragon was far too savvy a negotiator. And so what's wild about the Spanish Inquisition versus the medieval Inquisition is that the medieval Inquisition is a papal institution. The Spanish Inquisition is a monarchical institution whose officials get permission to do what they do from the Pope. And if Spanish inquisitors ever have to choose between being loyal to the Pope or the king, they will always choose the king. I hope that makes sense. It's complicated.
Yes, it is. I think that was a very good overview. And the Papal Inquisition is something I discussed more in the previous episode with Professor Paula Tartikoff, and that we discussed this distinction that you just laid out as well. So again, even though this is it's against heresy, against Christians, and it's Catholicism, but like you're saying, it's the king and queen, it's the monarchy that's in charge, not the Pope, which is a very interesting thing.
Right. So you would think then that these inquisitors would be fundamentally conflicted in terms of their loyalties. And what's fascinating about it is that they absolutely recognize papal authority, the authority of the Pope, but they know who named them. And that kind of patronage takes priority. So they're always going to side with Spanish monarchs if push comes to shove.
Right. Now, as you said, this Inquisition the Spanish Inquisition starts in 1478. But as you said, it was kind of in response to the conversos already from 1391. So, kind of just what happened in between that it took so long for them to start this?
Well, that is a fascinating question. And a lot of wonderful historians like David Nirenberg of the University of Chicago have pondered this like crazy. So what seems to happen in a nutshell is that you have this mass forced conversion of Jews, forced baptisms of Jews, men, women, and children in 1391 in the spring and summer. And at that point, they are officially Christian. They are allowed to assume jobs that they never were allowed to assume before. A number of them reach incredible success in the church, where we have bishops of Burgos, for instance, who were formerly Jews, who were forcibly converted, who rise to be bishops. And according to the experts I've read, you have a tremendous amount of social rage about the fact that converted Jews are achieving higher and higher socioeconomic status. And a number of cities like Toledo, for instance, in 1449, which is a very important city, it's the head of the Catholic Church in Spain, pass statutes that forbid conversos from holding city jobs. Popes then respond, interestingly enough, to say you must treat these converts as full-fledged Christians. You're not allowed to treat them as inferior Christians. And there are all kinds of literary works by theologians and canon lawyers arguing exactly the same thing. But what happens in the 1470s and 1480s is that Ferdinand and Isabel seem to be held captive to certain kinds of preaching by Franciscan friars in particular. So they go to winter, for instance, in the beautiful city of Sevilla in 1477 to 1478. And a Franciscan friar gets their ear and begins to tell them about all the false Christians who are really practicing Judaism in that city. And Ferdinand and Isabel write to Pope Sixtus IV. They get permission for an inquisition, but they do not install it for a year and a half, hoping to achieve through preaching and pastoral outreach full conversions of these allegedly false Christians. After they establish the Inquisition and the Inquisition gets going in 1480, they then experiment through the 1480s with partial expulsions, which is something that I didn't realize until way long into my graduate career. Nobody ever told me that actually Spain's Jews were expelled city by city by city in the 1480s. And so what they're trying to do, what they think they're trying to do, God love them or not, is to prevent what they think of as contamination of the converso population by the Jewish population. And this ultimately results in 1492 and the expulsion of Spanish Jews. So that's how that, culminates.
Right. Now, the Inquisition, 1492 culminates really with the, unification of Spain, kind of, we'll call it. And that's not in Navarre, maybe still not, but we'll say as unification of Spain. So before that, in 1478, though, where does the Inquisition start? And then when is it in the whole Spain?
Sure. So it is deputized. I mean, it's kind of interesting, Naki. It's deputized almost like a medieval Inquisition, where the king and queen appoint 2 Franciscan friars to go to Sevilla only. That's where they're allowed to go. They don't have any more purview than that. And they are to go to Sevilla and to investigate what we in the field call Judaizing conversos. So that means people who've converted, who are continuing to practice Mosaic law in some form or other. And we don't possess any of the trials. They've all been destroyed from this 2-3 year period, which is so regrettable because it would be amazing to learn what the witness testimony is like, what the interrogations are like, the use of torture, etc. But all those trials are gone. And so that makes it really hard for us in terms of reconstructing the early history of the persecution and the early history of the inquisitors as to what they were doing and how they were interrogating people and whether torture was even there. And so after I think the first auto de fe in Sevilla is held in 1481. And we don't even know how many people were burned at the stake or how many were penanced. And after that, the Spanish Inquisition spreads very rapidly in an ad hoc way throughout Castile and eventually into the Kingdom of Aragon. And the problem with the Kingdom of Aragon, which is made up of Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia, is that the Papal Inquisition in the medieval epoch existed there. And so there is no precedent for a king or queen of Spain or Aragon to put an inquisitor there. And there is tremendous resistance. And King Ferdinand of Aragon has to call in military troops, etc., to get the Inquisition established. And it's really a whole lot of no shan't resistance.
So as you mentioned, they come and they were kind of targeting Jews. So was it originally just Jews? I know the Papal Inquisition was heretics against the Catholic Church. So was that what this also was, or this was mainly targeting Jews, especially in the beginning, or like you said, conversos and Judaism?
Well, it's an amazing thing. I mean, we've learned so much over the last 40 years or so. After Francisco Franco died in November of 1975, all of a sudden, for the first time, historians were allowed to go into the archives and start reading the documents. And so people just poured it on in terms of energy, in terms of figuring out who the victims were at what stage in time. So Jews are not subject to the Spanish Inquisition theoretically because they're not Christian. And that is really always a surprise to my students. And the same holds for Muslims. Unless you are converted to Christianity, the Inquisition should have nothing to do with you. Now, you've had a wonderful session with Emily Michelson on, preaching to Jews in Rome. And it's absolutely true that the Inquisition in Italy and Spain sometimes interferes with Jewish populations in really negative ways. But by and large, their target is converts from Islam and Judaism to Christianity. So at the very beginning, there's no doubt that the target of the Inquisition is conversos, and that's a term that we Spanish historians use to denote Jewish converts to Christianity. By about 1502 and the 1520s, the interest shifts to Moriscos, which is a term that means Muslim converts from Islam to Christianity. Then it morphs again, and the Inquisition becomes interested in what is called old Christians, meaning Christians without Islamic or Jewish backgrounds, who are engaged in fornication, blasphemy, solicitation, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Inquisition will swing again to investigating conversos from Portugal when Spain takes over Portugal in 1580. And so forth and so on. So it's just it's a swinging pendulum in terms of interest. And it's very easy to understand why much earlier historians portrayed the Spanish Inquisition as an insatiable machine, as if it were just working to gobble up victims as fast as it could, and as if it were shifting its attention depending upon the rise and fall of populations. But we now know that actually it has to do with changes in Catholic Christianity in the 16th century that give the Inquisition new life and new energy in terms of seeking out what it was thinking of as heretics.
Okay, we'll get back to some of that a little later. So just one final general question before we get into how the Inquisition actually functioned and worked. So the idea was Ferdinand's? Whose idea was this to start this Inquisition?
There's a whole lot of debate on that as whether it was Ferdinand or Isabella. I think most historians would argue that they worked in tandem. They were, there's no separation of church and state in the 15th and the 16th century. And so expecting rulers to be agnostic is not plausible. And so they're Catholic, they're Christian, they care desperately about their reputation as Catholic monarchs. And they believe that they are ordained by God to protect Catholicism, wherever that might lead them. It's very difficult for us to understand now, or maybe not in modern times, but it's a whole different paradigm.
Okay,
in terms of religious tolerance. So,
right. Okay, so let's go. Let's talk about the Inquisition. So you mentioned before the Inquisitors. So who were they generally in the Spanish
Oh,
Inquisition, and how did they get appointed? What is that? What was that process like?
oh gosh, what a wonderful question. So there's a wonderful historian named Kimberly Lynn, who is at Western Washington University, who published a book 9 years ago called Between Court and Confessional, The Political Careers of Spanish Inquisitors. And her book is 5 case studies of incredibly important inquisitors. And what she shows in that book is that there's no single track. So there isn't an Inquisition school or an Inquisition degree that you can get in the 15th or the 16th century that would allow you to become, take the SAT of Inquisition studies and, be admitted to the Inquisition. In the earlier period between 1480 and 1520, inquisitors tend to be Franciscan or Dominican friars. After 1520, they are canon lawyers. So they have canon law degrees from Spanish universities. And they also tend to be in holy orders. So they tend to be priests. They tend to not be married. And so they're both canon lawyers and priests. And that's really interesting, Naki, in terms of what the aim of the Inquisition is supposed to be theoretically. So the whole point theoretically of the Inquisition, ideally, is to reconcile, meaning reincorporating heretics back to the Catholic faith. And so what looks to us as persecution, they're thinking of as salvation. And you can tell it by the vocabulary that they use. And so it's very easy for us as historians and bystanders to say, oh my God, they're just out for religious vengeance, persecution against these poor benign people. But from their standpoint, they're saving them. And that's why the punishments and the sentences that they exact, they call penances. So the idea is that after you serve your penance, you're going to be reincorporated to the Catholic Church, and they will have saved you. So what's wild about this simultaneous canon law priest connection is that they are always measuring mercy against justice, and they explain it as much in that way. So they are allegedly, hopefully, keeping both in mind all the time as they evaluate suspected heretics.
Okay, so we'll talk more also about penance and auto de fe and different things and the punishments. So, just want to mention one question to clarify. You mentioned Franciscan or Dominican friars. Can you just explain to the listeners if they're not familiar with a Franciscan or Dominican friar what that means?
Sure. So these are religious orders of the Catholic Church that were founded by Francis of Assisi and Dominic of Spain in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. They are different from monastic orders insofar as they're not necessarily confined to monasteries, as it would be the case with somebody like Benedict of Nursia in the 7th century, the 6th century. So these individuals, so the Franciscans are renowned for their preaching efforts and their efforts toward poverty. The Dominicans are renowned for their theological learning and their ability to argue. And so they become kind of papal guard dogs or watchdogs vis-a-vis heretics. They're out in the field. They're not bound to a monastery. They go out. They're interacting with ordinary people all the time. And they are imagined by the papacy and by Christianity as the guardians of orthodoxy, in a way.
Okay, so now we can get back to the different people involved in the trial. So in the and about some of this is also laid out in your book. Is a very nice, short, concise introduction that lays out some of this that we're discussing. But as well, so when we go now to each trial, a specific trial, there are a number. Before we get down to the specifics and the proceedings, which is really interesting. And obviously we also mean interesting for the conversos involved, obviously interesting in a bad way, interesting for us to learn about. Of course, this was terrible. But so there was inquisitors, and you mentioned there was canon lawyers, there was theologians, then you had prosecutors, constables. Can you kind of talk about the others involved in that? I mean, that will naturally get us after that to what the process was like.
Oh my goodness. I mean, it is an amazing bureaucracy, which is why some people have pinpointed the Inquisition as a harbinger of modernity because of their astonishing reliance on paper and their ability to track people across distance and over time. I mean, Nagi, I can't begin to convey to you and your listeners how expert they are at tracking people down across the Atlantic, across the Pacific. It's mind-boggling. So, okay, so you have an Inquisition tribunal that's established in a particular city. You have at least two inquisitors, formal inquisitors, stationed at that tribunal. They hire a prosecutor. They have a constable who is responsible for going out and finding and bringing back suspects. They have a jail, a private jail, into which you put suspects while they're undergoing trial. You have a warden of the jail. You have an official who oversees what is called the sequestered property of the suspect. So, for instance, if I were arrested on suspicion of heresy, my property would be sequestered and held until the end of my trial. If I were found guilty, it then would be confiscated. And there are officials who keep track. It's mind-boggling to think about all the movable property, how much it's worth, who's in charge of it, who's protecting it, what happens when it's confiscated. And then the money goes to the crown. The money goes to the Spanish monarchy. You have an astonishing number of notaries. And I think any of you out there who've had to have a document notarized will know what I'm talking about here. These are secretaries who literally write down formally under oath the proceedings of a trial. And there are notaries who are called of the secret, del secreto, and they're the ones who are privileged to sit there during trial work and take down documentation. There is also a defense lawyer for the accused who is named. If the suspect is under the age of 25, there is a guardian who is named. And then there are the consultants. So I'm arrested on suspicion of heresy. My inquisitors in the city of Williamsburg would call in consultants to look at the statements against me to decide what the heresy was and how serious it was. Then, after the trial had concluded, they would call in another round of consultants to decide what the penalty should be. And those consultants would confer with the inquisitors. So as you can imagine, this takes time. It's a lengthy process. It's not quick. There's always a presumption of guilt. So you're presumed guilty unless you can prove your innocence. And I can talk more about defense strategies when the right time comes.
Yeah, I want to so let's start at the beginning before the defense strategy. So
sure.
So they're going out to find a heretic, right? So how is an arrest made? And even before the arrest, how do they know? Is it somebody comes and tells somebody, comes and tells the inquisitor, hey, we have this neighbor, we have this family member, whatever it is, friend. Yes. Is that how it starts? And then how do they make the arrest?
Well, it does. And I mean, what's really, really, really interesting is that as the Spanish Inquisition goes along, people arrive to self-denounce because a confession immediately to the inquisitors means you will not be burned at the stake and you will be let off with a penance. So if you decide to take the initiative and show up and say, wow, I really swore a whole lot during my last game of cards, they might yell at you, they might be angry at you, but they will let you off with a penance. They will not subject you to exile, perpetual prison, burning at the stake, etc. They also operate through depositions from neighbors. They also can go out. So it's interesting to think about this Latin root inquisitio, which means inquiry. So the inquisitors can send out investigators upon rumors of who might be a heretic in your local community, and they can call people in under oath to give testimony. And then what happens is the constable goes out to arrest me, let's say in my little house on College Terrace in Williamsburg, Virginia, and everybody will see me being arrested. And I will then be taken to a prison, and there will be allegedly no communication with me thereafter. My family members cannot visit me. Neighbors won't know where I am. Nobody will know what is happening to me, which kind of augments the weight of what is going on in terms of fear and terror and so on. And they will put me into prison. And then what will happen is an inquisitor like you will come in and have 3 interviews with me. literally 3. And you will come in, and they're not all on the same day. They're on successive days or over 2 weeks. You will come in and tell me why and ask me why I should confess to religious error. You will give me an opportunity to confess. And I could confess right away. I could not confess right away. And if I don't confess during those 3 admonitions, the process will go to trial. And that's when your tribunal's prosecutor will prepare a written list of charges that will be read to me orally in person. And I am expected to respond instantly orally to the charges. And after that, it's what happens next is both sides are received is called to proof. So that means a probationary period, and it's usually 9 days. And the prosecutor will produce written statements of prosecution witnesses from which all identifying markers are gone. So I am never allowed to know as the defendant who testified against me, what day, what time, etc. And then I, in turn, will produce a written document. I will dictate it to a notary because typically I'm illiterate. I will dictate it to a notary who is there of my response to the charges. And we go from there.
Okay, so before we get to the tribunal, though, I mean, we're going back and forth, but I'm saying if you're in the actual process, okay, you're arrested. Now we get to the tribunal. Before the tribunal, I'm sorry. So I guess kind of what listeners are probably familiar with the Inquisition is torture. So let's talk a little bit about that and how prevalent this was, what kind of methods of torture there were, and everything involved with torture.
So torture is never administered before an arrest or during an arrest or during the 3 admonitions to get me to confess. Never. Torture is never administered against the elderly, people over 70, over 60. It never happens. It's never administered against children. It is not unusual for torture to be ordered and then called off if someone is ill or incapacitated. And of course, your listeners will know I'm not trying to excuse this in any way, shape, or form. So torture happens when I refuse to confess after 3 admonitions. The prosecutor presents his statement of proof. I present my statement of proof. The inquisitors look at the opposing statements, and they decide that, boy, there's a whole lot of evidence against Louis and Homza in terms of heresy. And so then they have to vote with consultants on whether I should be admitted to torture. Now, inquisitors cannot themselves administer torture because they're in holy orders. So you have professional torturers who make this a career, who are hired by the tribunal. The torture is administered inside the tribunal, and it proceeds according to stages. And the point of it is to get me to confess before I'm actually tortured. So it's a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of terror-inducing. That's the point of it. So I would be walked into a torture room with instruments there. I would be told that I would be tortured. I would be asked if I wanted to confess. I then would be shown the instruments of torture, literally, like here they are. And would you like to confess? I would be stripped down to my underwear. Would you like to confess? And if you last that long, then the torture takes 3 forms. Most unfortunately, or whatever, the Spanish Inquisition invented waterboarding from the Iraq War. And that, in my experience, is the most common form of torture in the sources that I read. So it is forcible drowning. You're put on a bench and your head is cocked back, and pitchers of water are poured into your nose and mouth. So it simulates drowning. The other form of torture is binding, where they put cords around your arms and legs and tighten them to the point that you think your arms or legs are going to be amputated. The third form is hoisting you behind with your arms behind your back up like this so that your shoulders are dislocated. And that's pretty rare. That is more common in secular settings, in my experience, than the other 2 forms. And when people confess under torture, the torture stops, And then they are asked to ratify their testimony 2 or 3 days later without torture. And that is absolutely a precedent from Roman law, because Romans knew that people could confess under torture due to duress, and they wouldn't really mean it. And so therefore you must make them confess without the torture. And let me just note that you were only allowed to torture people in the Spanish Inquisition for a certain duration of time and a certain number of times. And the way they get around this is to, quote unquote, suspend the torture versus end the torture. So it can be suspended and then be recommenced at a later date.
Now, how common was the torture? This happened how often? Each case, every case, not so common, was very common?
I'm so sorry to tell you and your listeners that there is no way for us to know, because so many of the documents are gone. We presume, and we think we have good reason to presume, that the period 1480 to 1520 was the most prevalent for torture, and we're lacking perhaps 70% of that documentation. The best historians who studied this the most thoroughly think that torture was comparatively rare. So perhaps 10%, perhaps 15% of all the Inquisition cases. But there's no doubt that people on the outside of the Inquisition knew that torture could occur and that it terrified them accordingly. Ditto the numbers of people who were burned at the stake, which is also very rare, but people knew and they witnessed people who were burned at the stake. And that also served as what you might call a pedagogical tool.
Okay, so even though not everyone, but in a lot of people's mind, there's always the Spanish Inquisition. You say Spanish Inquisition, they think arrest, torture, burning at the stake. You're saying that's more the sensationalized aspect. It's not necessarily what was going on in most instances.
No, it absolutely is not. It absolutely is not. Now, that being said, the Spanish Inquisition very rarely exonerates anybody. They very rarely admit error. When they do, it's remarkable. And one of my very favorite sources that I put into my reader has to do with a man named Pedro Villegas, who manages to outsmart the inquisitors because he calls the most excellent witnesses imaginable. He is arrested in 1484 for allegedly practicing Mosaic law. He has an injury. He's a weaver. And at some point, the loom broke, threw him across the wall or across the house, broke his arm. He's incapacitated. And so he gets to eat meat during Lent, which is a sign of practicing Mosaic law. And so he's arrested, he's put on trial. He has one witness after another who are the most superb deponents. They've known him for 40 years. They've known him for 30 years. They've known him for 25 years. They've administered communion to him during the Easter sacrament. They have listened to his confessions. They saw him get injured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of that trial, he's let go. It must have been a miserable experience for him. And I don't know that his wife was judged innocent, because here's the other bizarre thing, really, really interesting. There's a wonderful historian who's an Israeli historian named Renee Melamed, who has investigated converso trials in this early period, 1480 to 1520, and women are by far the preferred targets of the Inquisition because they are in charge of the household and dietary measures. And they are the ones following Mosaic law in terms of the Sabbath and bathing and candles and so on. And so we have male figures. I mean, you wouldn't believe this. We have male figures who have 3 wives burned at the stake. And they keep marrying one conversa after another. And one conversa after another ends up accused of Judaizing, and the husbands get off and the women are burned. And that's an amazing thing.
And some of these cases are included in the anthology, in the reader?
They are. Yep, they sure are.
Okay, so I want to jump back to the process of the tribunal. So you said whether there's torture or there's no torture, confession, etc. So they come down to the tribunal. So you mentioned there's a prosecution, and you mentioned there are defense attorneys. So you mentioned kind of before the defense strategy. So first of all, how you say they were supplied with a defense attorney? I mean, how effective, how really kind of legit were these lawyers that they're kind of provided with to defend them?
Well, it's quite astonishing because many of them are amazingly effective in terms of understanding how to undercut the Inquisition's case. And what's equally bizarre is that they're hired by the Inquisition tribunal. So they're working against their alleged interests and privileges privileges and patronage networks by defending these clients. But some of them are really, really good at what they do. And they bring up, so for instance, you can as a defense. So I as a defendant wouldn't know who had testified against me, wouldn't know any of the background. So how do I possibly defend myself? Well, I can produce character witnesses who will testify that they've seen me at Mass, they've seen me baptize my children, they've seen me fast during Lent, etc. I can produce witnesses who will cast doubt on the prosecution testimony, and which again, that's a little dicey because you don't know who the witnesses are. But probably the most interesting and fraught method of defense is, it's called tachas, from tachar, which means to stain. And so what you do is you go into court and you name everybody who wishes you dead, in the hopes that the prosecution witnesses feature those same individuals who wish you dead. And this is where it's a frigging gold mine in terms of social history to read these trials, in terms of these village relationships and the enmities that are going on, the animosities, who hates whom the most, who might want to use the Inquisition, the local Inquisition tribunal, to gain vengeance on a relative, on an enemy, etc. And so we get all this testimony about all these quarrels that people have had on the village level, selling a vine, selling a pig, begging for charity, sneaking into someone's house and stealing things. It illustrates how incredibly non-private these communities are and how open their doors are, because the doors are never shut. And that is a revelation for students. So if you can prove capital enmity, meaning that somebody who testified against you, and you don't know their identity, but you guess rightly, wishes you dead, their testimony should be stricken from the record. And the Inquisition should not be able to use it.
Does that indeed happen?
It does. It does. Yeah. But what also happens, most unfortunately, is that I'm under torture. I'm suffering extremely. And I decide to accuse all kinds of people of heresy who didn't commit heresy. And then the Inquisition investigates them. They come back to me and they tell me that I lied. I lied under oath. Lying under oath makes me a heretic. And then I'm doomed. So.
And that, I guess, you've seen that happen time and time again from the sources as well.
I have. I mean, people can get really desperate and really angry. And yeah. So you know what this relates to is whether or not the Spanish Inquisition was popular in Spain, from the moment it was founded until the moment it ended. And there is so much contradictory evidence on this. It's just fascinating. There are numbers of people who use the Inquisition as a tool against their enemies. There's also overwhelming evidence of opposition to it on every level, all sexes, all ages. So what I like about this is that we're left with a very complicated picture of this institution, and I think that's appropriate.
So you mentioned earlier that it wasn't often that suspects were let go. So essentially what usually happens, as you're saying, they're not usually cleared and let go. So what generally is the outcome of these cases?
So putting aside the individuals who are convicted of heresy, or who found guilty of relapsing into heresy, and this again speaks to the Inquisition as a paper machine, as a bureaucratic entity. So if I had been tried, for instance, in 1494 for Judaizing, and I went back before the Inquisition in 1498, the Inquisitors would be able to find the 1494 trial. And they would be able to say, Luann, you've relapsed into heresy. And if I really, really confessed well, maybe I would get off without the stake, but it's not likely. So let's say we put those cases aside where the evidence is overwhelming from the Inquisitor's point of view and or you've relapsed. So you're an ordinary heretic. You practice Mosaic law. You've practiced Islam. You've blasphemed. You've fornicated. You practice bigamy. You're a priest who has solicited sex with a confessant. And so what's going to happen to you? So you can be sent to a convent or a monastery for re-education purposes, especially if you're elderly, and you tell the inquisitors that you know nothing about Christianity, and that happens. You can be exiled. You can be sentenced to certain periods of house arrest or what is called perpetual prison, though it's never perpetual. They just like the way it sounds. You can be ordered to wear a garment called a San Benito, which we think the etymology of that word, Sambenito, refers to blessed smock, and it's yellow with red demons painted all over it. And you can be ordered to wear that every time you leave your house or prison for a certain period of time. You can be ordered to pay for masses, to stand at mass, bare-legged with a candle in your hand. It runs the gamut in terms of offenses, but they're all public and they're meant to be didactic in terms of purpose so that your heresies will be known and people will know not to do as, for instance, I have done.
Now, these punishments that you mentioned are what you referred to earlier as a penance?
Yeah. That's how they're told. That is their nomenclature by the Spanish Inquisition. And the point is that you atone for your sin, which was your heresy, and then you are readmitted to the Catholic Church in good faith. The difficulty is, of course, is that if I am penanced for blaspheming, for swearing, for telling someone to F off, right, during a card game, and then I come back up before the Inquisition 4 years later, I am in the position of being called a relapsed heretic, which means I'm in real trouble.
So that's something else that that's something else I wanted to ask you. So I can ask you already now is that, a lot of these things that you're mentioning are, listeners may think of, more serious issues in their mind. Like somebody was, like you're saying, they were a converso and suddenly they're back practicing Judaism.
Right.
Not as if playing cards or some other thing. So first of all, how common was it? Also, what was the percentage, especially in the early years of the Inquisition, for it being against, I guess, I don't say popular culture, but people are familiar with it. Oh, it's against conversos. That's who was targeting. Was that mostly the case? Or no, it was really, it wasn't.
No. So it ebbs and flows. So let's say 1480 to 1520, it is overwhelmingly conversos who are suspected of practicing Mosaic law. 1520 to 1570 or 1560, it is people who are engaged in mystical practices that the Inquisition doesn't understand, people who are very sympathetic to Martin Luther and other Protestant leaders, people who are blaspheming regularly. And the argument about the blasphemy and the bigamy and the fornication is, if you're truly a Catholic, you wouldn't do those things. So therefore, you must be a heretic. So it's this kind of sleight of hand, a kind of deductive process as to your religious beliefs. And I will say, people who blaspheme very often show up before the inquisitors to confess their guilt, because they always are blaspheming before witnesses. And many ordinary people, this goes back to support for the Inquisition in Spain, many ordinary people in Spain are shocked and horrified at blasphemy. And we have accounts of, priests who decide to go to southern France and become a Lutheran, and their buddies in northern Spain who are Catholic get on a boat to go rescue them and bring them back to the Catholic faith because they're so upset about the potential turncoat nature of their friend. So it's very, very interesting. So lots and lots of witnesses, and in terms of supporting this horrible institution, lots of witnesses really worry about people who are not behaving in a Catholic manner.
Wow. So then we get to the other punishment, as you mentioned, auto de fe, burning. Was that the preferred, burned at the stake? Is that the preferred, if it's going to be punishment by death? Is that the only way that they did it? And why did they do it that way? Why was it that way?
So 9 times out of 10, convicted heretics are strangled before the fire is lit. It is also possible on your way to the stake, because the stake, burning at the stake never occurs inside cities, it occurs outside of cities. So you have this long kind of penitential walk after the auto de fe, where your sentence has been read, you've been convicted to death at the stake, which you would have known beforehand. And you're walking outside the city, and there are all kinds of Dominican and Franciscan friars accompanying you, begging you to repent and to ask for forgiveness. And very often you do. And at that point, you go on the scaffold. And well, actually, I back up. If you repent sincere, and they think it's sincere enough, they'll bring you back to the tribunal to see if you really should be penanced instead of executed. They also have the discretion to march you to the tribunal, to burn you at the stake, but they strangle you first. Recalcitrant heretics are burned without being strangled. They're rare, but it happens. So, and in terms of why they do this, this goes back to the medieval epic in terms of how to set an example. It's not something the Spanish Inquisition invents. It's something that happens in the Middle Ages. And, in the Middle Ages also, more extremely, houses are burned down, which does not happen under the Spanish Inquisition at all. But, houses can be razed. It's also important to note that both the medieval and the Spanish Inquisitions can investigate the dead. And so if you have enough testimony about a dead person, you can exhume the body and burn the body at the stake.
Wow. And now, either the dead or going back just to the regular person that's burned at the stake. So just to finish off here, so does anything happen to any of the family members? And also, we had mentioned earlier, okay, so what happens to the family members?
Yeah, so if you are a relative of a convicted heretic burned at the stake, your life in terms of honor and honorable positions is basically over. You're not allowed to ride horses. You're not allowed to own certain kinds of fabric or jewels or pearls. You can't assume certain positions in governments, etc. And that applies to the entire family and the descendants.
Now, we mentioned earlier that the property gets confiscated while the trial's going on.
Yes.
So assuming, I shouldn't assume, I should ask you this. If the punishment is penance, what happens to property? If the punishment is death, burned at the stake, what happens to the property?
Okay, that's really important. And this is something we have one pivotal study from 1978 about the Inquisition's finances, and we need so much more work done, because let me tell you, the surviving documents are so confusing and fascinating, and nobody wants to touch them because, man, they are hard. So in a nutshell, you're arrested, your property is sequestered, which is not confiscated. Your property is taken into guardianship. I guess that's the way you would phrase it now. And should you be penanced, your property will go back to you, perhaps with some confiscations, but generally it will go back to you. If you're burned at the stake, your property is confiscated, and it goes to the use of the crown and the Inquisition tribunal that put you on that prosecuted you. So we used to think, this is really interesting, we used to think that inquisitors made their living and grew incredibly rich through these confiscations of property. We now know that's absolutely not the case. They are desperately poor, believe it or not, because most of it goes to the crown. And what the inquisitors do in turn is, they're priests as well as canon lawyers. And so they have what we call benefices or church offices in various parishes around the diocese that help them bring in a yearly sum, much like a mutual fund or Social Security would bring in a yearly sum. And that's how they support themselves.
Okay,
and I just wanted to add this too. It probably can't be underestimated how much malfeasance occurs in terms of the money. And I don't mean that on the inquisitor's point, but on the notary's point and the people who are working for them, who are always after more, and who have, based on the fact that they're taking down all this incredibly intimate, sworn secret testimony, can perform all kinds of extortion.
Yeah, as could be expected in such instances. So a general question here about the Inquisition, or maybe this is another one of these kind of myths, I don't know why. it's kind of prevalent that the Inquisition, somehow people think it has something to do with 1492, which in the expulsion of Spain, which is not really the case. As we've mentioned, it starts in 1478. It has more to do with 1391 with the forced conversions. Right. But I'm not going to ask you where it comes from. Everyone thinks that's with 1492 and it's like a post-expulsion thing. But what kind of, I guess, what does 1492 do to the Inquisition? What kind of role does it play there in the Inquisition's development, I guess, so to speak?
That's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful question. So it creates a whole new generation of conversos. So we have, and this is just the most fascinating stuff. I have a colleague named Sarah Nalle, Nalle, who is now an emeritus from Patterson University in New Jersey, who is a specialist on Cuenca and the Inquisition in Cuenca. She knows those sources better than anybody. And Sally has been able to track, you won't believe this, generations of conversos in that city from 1391 versus 1492. These generations of conversos know when they converted, and they do not intermarry. They remain completely endogamous in terms of their generation of conversion, which is just mind-blowing, right? I mean, it's just amazing. So you have an older generation of conversos, 1391, then a new generation of conversos in 1492. How do they get along? How do they speak to each other? What do they do about each other? This remains a field of tremendous interest for all of us. All of us. I mean, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on a very important and popular vernacular theologian named Pedro Ciruelo, who was born about 1460 and who most definitely is a converso, because Sally, my friend in Cuenca, found the Inquisition documents of the trials of his relatives. And Ciruelo managed to invoke Mosaic law in every single Christian text he ever wrote. Wow. And he was never put on trial. And he translated the Old Testament, the Torah, from Hebrew into Latin over and over again in the 1520s and the 1530s. And he was actually entertained as the tutor for for Philip II, the son of Charles V. So, there is so much inventiveness and flexibility with these populations. Is just amazing.
Very interesting. So another thing is that what we've been discussing this whole entire podcast episode is the Spanish Inquisition, as your book discusses. There is a Portuguese Inquisition established in 1537, I think, and then there is Inquisitions established in the Americas. Those are, just to briefly touch, those are just different, kind of function the same way under different governments.
Well, the thing about the Portuguese Inquisition that is just mind-boggling is, so Spain expels its Jews in 1492. And many of them run to Portugal. Portugal expels its Jews in 1497, but it also gives them 20 years to live in Portugal without threat of prosecution. The Portuguese Inquisition, I have to look at my notes to make sure I've got this correctly. The Portuguese Inquisition isn't established until 1532, and it's not active until the 1540s. So that gives Jews who ran to Portugal in 1492 from Spain almost an additional 40 plus years to practice Judaism. And that is why it is so cool to see when Spain absorbs Portugal in 1580, to see Portuguese conversos crossing the border back into Spain, heading to Amsterdam, heading to France for economic opportunities, and they are tutors in rabbinical Judaism to Spanish conversos, because Spanish conversos have not had rabbis for X decades and decades and decades. And I don't know if your audience is familiar with the work of the amazing historian Miriam Bodian, Bodian, who is an emerita professor from the University of Texas at Austin. But Miriam Bodian wrote an amazing book called Hebrews of the Portuguese Nation, which tracks the Sephardim's movement from Spain and Portugal to Amsterdam, and the amazing re-education, quote unquote, effort that went on the part of the Ashkenazi Jews vis-a-vis the Sephardic Jews, who didn't know anything about what they were doing in terms of the Sabbath, in terms of rabbinical learning, the Talmud, et cetera, et cetera. It's just the most poignant story. It's so cool.
Right, for sure. And again, as I mentioned, there also is Inquisition in the Americas as well.
So the Inquisition in the Americas is slow, very slow. Looking at my notes. So, Mexico, sorry, I have to figure this out. Mexico City is 1568. Lima, Peru is 1570. Cartagena de las Indias in West Martin de Colombia is 1609. And they have different ambitions. They do not prosecute indigenous peoples. They go after African American slaves. They go after women who are healers and alleged witches. They try to practice censorship, which is like a no-go. They can't possibly stop it. And they operate very often as sort of rogue agents vis-a-vis the central authority in Spain. Because, as I said, the Inquisition is a master at paper and bureaucracy, but their reach doesn't extend that far. They can't possibly manage it. And in terms of the Portuguese Inquisition, we just don't know enough. Not enough people work on it, most unfortunately.
Right. Okay. So getting back to the Spanish Inquisition, so kind of two questions. First of all, so your book, like I mentioned all the way in the beginning by the title, is 1478 to 1614. Mm-hmm. Why do you stop in 1614? And then we'll get to when the Inquisition finishes, because that's not the end of the Inquisition.
No. So I stopped in 1614 because when I wrote that book in 2006, when I published that book in 2006, that was our customary terminus ad quem for the Spanish Inquisition. Now, what's weird about that date, and it's not a good date to end with, is that is the date at which the end of the expulsion of the Moriscos occurs. So Spanish Muslims are forcibly converted between 1502 and 1526, and depending upon where they live, their fates are incredibly different. So in Granada, for instance, Muslims who convert, who are a majority of the population, have no wealthy protectors at all. In the Kingdom of Valencia, to the east of Spain, in contrast, Muslims who convert to Christianity are primarily agricultural workers, and they have astonishingly powerful protectors, namely local lords. And so what's really interesting is, depending upon what part of the Spanish Inquisition you study, you come up with very different conclusions. So I told your listeners a little while ago about how the Spanish Inquisition's motive is reconciliation to the Catholic Church and mercy and pardon and so on. My colleagues who studied the Inquisition in the Kingdom of Valencia would say it is a money-making extortion enterprise. Because in Valencia, the lords agree to pay the Spanish inquisitors a certain sum for 40 years so that their Moriscos will not be prosecuted. And later in the 1570s, those same Moriscos agree to pay themselves a certain amount of money to Spanish inquisitors so that their goods won't be confiscated if they're put on trial for heresy. So, depending upon where you look, you get completely different images of this institution. So in any case, expulsion of the converted Muslims is proposed in Spain as early as the 1570s. The king at that time, Philip II, resoundly rejects it. Bishops reject it. Archbishops reject it. Popes reject it. It keeps being proposed. And in 1609, in wake of Spain's peace treaty with the Dutch, it's viewed as a counter honor, let's recoup our honor, by expelling this population. And the expulsion lasts from 1609 to 1614. It's estimated, unlike the expulsion of the Jews, we have better figures for the expulsion of the Moriscos in this 5-year period, 1609 to 1614. We calculate it to be about 300,000 people. And it is viewed as the single worst political and economic decision of the Spanish monarchy between 1500 and 1700. Because what the Spanish monarchy does is to expel its agricultural labor force over this 5-year period. And what makes this even worse from an economic social history point of view is that Spain has been suffering from plague and has lost perhaps a quarter of their population between 1592 and 1609. So, if you're looking for success and being able to feed your population, et cetera, and then you expel everybody who works the land, it's really not a good idea. So in any case, if I were to be able to do that reader over, which I hope someday before I die I will be able to do, I would not stop the reader at 1614. I would go to 1700, and we would look at all the kinds of heretics who were prosecuted in the latter half of the 17th century.
Now, the Inquisition, though, goes until the 19th century, till 1834, even though it kind of stops. Maybe you want to mention that, but the 19th century, it kind of stops.
It does. And I don't, there are very few studies of the Inquisition's activity between, let's say, 1808 and 1834. There is a whole bunch of new scholarship conducted mostly by women in Spain at the University of Cantabria and the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, who are looking at the Spanish Inquisition in the 18th century in the Americas as well as Spain. And so I can tell you some of their names. You had wanted me to give you, suggestions for further reading. So Maria Torres Arce and Patricia Manning and Maria Jesus Zamora Calvo are all new young Spanish historians working on the Inquisition in the 18th century, and they're very attentive to gender and women and so on. But we definitely lack studies of that latter period of time. And so, so there's tons of room for people who are interested in pursuing this in terms of scholarship, lots and lots of room.
Now, just getting back to your reader, which, as we mentioned a couple of times, and if people or listeners are interested in reading about some, primary sources and what really was going on, testimony, trials, and things like that, it's very, very important to read. I will put a link in the show's notes to purchase the book. So I don't know if you mentioned some, at least one story, some stories before, and if you want to mention any others, you can. But how did you select these stories, trials, various ones to put in the reader?
Oh, goodness. Well, that was a really bunch of hard choices. There's an amazing, now deceased Israeli historian named Chaim Beinart, who published 4 volumes of Inquisition trials that he transcribed and edited from Ciudad Real in the various earliest period of Inquisition history. And I cannot recommend those 4 volumes strongly enough to your readers. If your readers have basic Spanish, if their students have basic Spanish, you can get those 4 volumes through interlibrary loan through any university, or perhaps through any public library. The NY, New York University, New York Public Library would have them for sure. And you can get yourself into the primary sources. So what I was looking for was diversity in terms of the range of testimonies and victims and defense strategies and targets that the Inquisition focused on within my time frame. So I wanted people who mounted excellent defenses. I wanted people who completely failed at defenses. I wanted antagonism toward the Inquisition. I wanted acquiescence toward the Inquisition. So it kind of ran the gamut in that way. And I wanted basically an equal balance in terms of men and women. But again, my focus was Spain proper. I did not do the Americas. Had I done the Americas, my choices would have been very different. I would have amplified the volume a great deal, for sure.
Right. Now, something I don't think we emphasized enough so far. I mean, you kind of have, we mentioned constantly the sources, and this book is an anthology of sources. But the Spanish Inquisition, and you said about their paper, but they kept such meticulous sources, although you mentioned certain time periods, certain areas were missing sources. But I mean, why? How did they keep such copious records?
Oh my God. They have secretaries. They have secretaries coming out their ears. And they have and I think this is what they inherit from the medieval Inquisitions, because the medieval Inquisitions also kept records like nobody's business. And the Spanish Inquisitions follow along that line. And the Spanish Inquisition also is blessed or not, depending upon your point of view, with monarchs like Charles V, who established state archives. I mean, Spain has the first state archive in Western Europe in 1543 in Simancas, which is outside the city of Valladolid. Your readers can look it up. It's mind-boggling. It's got all the state papers. I mean, this is earlier than England, for heaven's sake. So Spain is really interested in bureaucracy and record keeping. Now, in terms of mediation and why we should trust or not trust these sources, if I could talk a little bit about that, if that would be okay with you. So what makes the Spanish Inquisition sources different from the Italian Inquisition sources is that Spain, from the 13th century on, kept its governmental papers in Spanish rather than Latin. The Italian Inquisition, in contrast, which is founded again in the 1540s, keeps its sources in Latin. And what happens is people come in and they testify in their vernacular dialects, and it's then transcribed into Latin. In Spain, in contrast, you or I would go in before an inquisitor, talk in Spanish, somebody would transcribe it in Spanish. So that lessens a sense of mediation for a modern historian in terms of how much could go wrong with this. Now, that being said, let me note that my latest book is devoted to testimony before the Inquisition by people who are Basque speakers. And there's no evidence that any inquisitor in the history of Spain or Portugal ever learned Basque. So that requires translation. And that's where you can kind of go sideways with just how much intervention is involved as people are telling their stories. But it's important to note that when you give testimony in the Spanish Inquisition, you have to ratify it, which means that people read it back to you and you have to agree that it's true. And so at that moment in time, you have a chance to add to it, reject it, correct it, etc. And so that kind of heightens our trust in it to the extent that we can trust it. It's also important to note that much of the testimony in Inquisition trials is not given under torture. So that adds to our trust as well.
Right. Okay. So, but there are some historians that take another view of that, right? I just want to clarify. Some don't use it so much, the sources, right?
Yeah. Right. But I'll tell you, I mean, it's sitting right there. We have volume upon volume. How can we not try to cope with it in terms of, resurrecting life stories that otherwise would never be told in terms of the victims of the Inquisition? This is where I feel the ethical imperative. We are restoring the voices of the dead by examining these sources. And what I also like to think is appearing before an inquisitor is never a casual experience, ever, in my reading of these sources. Nobody takes it for granted. Nobody thinks, woohoo, you're a buffoon, I'm going to walk out of here. And so people say what is the most rhetorically compelling thing they can think of to say about their defense, their beliefs, their exoneration, etc. And so I think that's useful.
Okay, so just one final question before you mentioned suggested reading. Before we talk about that, is there one particular case, one particular story, I guess, that you want to mention? I don't want to say that it could be fascinating, it could be moving. There's so many different, you can take a different word and you can different description. You can come up with a different case each time. But is there one that you wanted to tell listeners about? One that you just I don't want to use it.
No. Could I give you two? Would two be okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, so wow. The first chapter of my very first monograph, Religious Authority in the Spanish Renaissance, concerned the Inquisition trial of the secretary to the Archbishop of Toledo. And his name was Juan de Vergara. And he was a correspondent, believe it or not, of Desiderius Erasmus in the first half of the 16th century, who's the most famous intellectual in early modern Europe. And boy, did Juan de Vergara love that. And Juan de Vergara's half-brother gets arrested by the Spanish Inquisition in Toledo. And Juan de Vergara hatches a scheme, which is your family is responsible for your upkeep while you're in an Inquisition jail, if so long as they can afford it. And so what the brother does for the half-brother is to smuggle secret messages written in lemon juice inside the food offerings that are going to the half-brother in the jail. And the half-brother reads the messages by lighting a match behind the parchment and burning it so that the letters appear. I encourage my listeners not to attempt this at home. I nearly set someone's dining room table on fire many years ago by trying to see if this really would work. It does really work, but you don't want to do it in your house. So the extent to which these Inquisition prisoners communicate in the prisons is mind-boggling. They carve holes in the prison walls. Their servants go back and forth with secret messages. It's astonishing. The other favorite case happens in Sevilla in the 1460s, where a whole bunch of prisoners break out of their cells, throw the jailer out of the window of the prison, which is 3 stories up, and manage to relock themselves back in their cells. And the inquisitors spend, I kid you not, 2.5 years trying to figure out how they did it. So, inventiveness par excellence.
Wow.
Resistance par excellence. It's great.
Yeah, I think the lemon juice fire thing, isn't that what happens in National Treasure with the Declaration of Independence kind of thing?
I know.
So it's a real thing. It's a real thing.
No, it's really, really a real thing. It's really, really a real thing. It's very cool. So thank you so much for having me on.
Sure. Thank you for coming on. As you mentioned, I think so. I again will include a link to the Spanish Inquisition, an anthology of sources. Did you have? So we mentioned a number of books throughout. You mentioned a number of friends throughout the episode. Did you have any others that you wanted to mention?
Well, I do. Okay, so for your general reader, Henry Kamen, Kamen, The Spanish Inquisition, A Historical Revision. It's available on Kindle for $14, is spectacular. James Amling from Madrid's Universidad Autónoma has a book called Parallel Histories, Muslims and Jews in Inquisitorial Spain. Kindle is $20. My latest book is Village Infernos and Witches Advocates, which is $20 on Kindle. And that's about it. And I would be very happy. Would you mind posting my email address also in case people want to correspond with me?
Of course. And you could say it now and I'll add it to the show's notes as well.
All right. So it's all lowercase LAHOMZ@wm.edu. I'd be very happy to hear from you. It would be a pleasure.
Okay, so if any listeners have questions or any other comments, please email Professor Homza. And thank you very much, Professor Homza, for coming on to talk about the Spanish Inquisition.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Wish everybody a Happy New Year.